What is Mimblewimble? How does it work? What are Grin and Beam? And should you be investing in these new technologies or not? And welcome to today's video. My name is Julian, and on this channel I talk about blockchain, cryptocurrencies, decentralization, and co. to make people all around the world crypto fit. And today I want to talk about quite a new coin, or a new protocol, better to call, called Mimblewimble. Mimblewimble has been quite a hot topic at the moment, and many people talk about it. However, only very few people actually understand how this works. And in my Crash Course Cryptography series that's also on this YouTube channel, I will link it up below. I will actually go into great detail into how the crypto and the mathematics work in Mimblewimble. It's really fascinating. In this video, I want to give you a complete but quite easy guide in understanding Mimblewimble and making an educated decision for yourself. And I do want to have a quick caveat up front. Just because I talk about Mimblewimble doesn't mean that I don't like any of the other privacy coins. I am a big fan, for example, of Monero, and I will make actually separate videos on those as well, and I will link up the cryptography on Monero in the description below, because I think these are exciting terms. But then whenever something quite new comes around, I think it is worth looking into and kind of discussing how do these things work, and how relevant are they. In this case, what I want to do, I want to go into the blog post that I have written to that, and I'm going to also link this up below. It's quite an extensive blog post, and I want to go through this blog post with you because, especially in something like Mimblewimble, it does help to have a bit of a graphic visual attached to this, and not only me talking and my head bouncing. So let's go into the blog post and have a look what this is all about. Let's maybe start off with what Mimblewimble actually is. And Mimblewimble is nothing else than a new protocol for creating censorship-resistant digital money. And that is very important now, that offers 100% privacy. That's key, because we do have censorship-resistant money, for example with Bitcoin, but we don't have the 100% privacy in Bitcoin. Now we do have with other technologies, and this is something to ask, what is the problem that Mimblewimble actually solves? And if we compare it to Bitcoin, it becomes clear that Bitcoin is very transparent. We see the entire transaction history, we see the ledger, and many times it's caused some problems. It causes problems with fungibility. It raises the question, how much privacy are we entitled to have? Now, Mimblewimble is not a privacy coin or the first privacy coin. There are many great privacy coins out there, for example Monero and many others, and they do have great tech, they have great cryptography. And so it is important to kind of look into this and understand, what does Mimblewimble do better and what does it do worse? So if we talk about this new protocol, then what we're going to see is that for a transaction, what we actually need to know is always the from, the to, and an amount. And this is very straightforward. And this is actually a very basic concept. And if we look at Bitcoin, how Bitcoin does that, it does that through what's called a UTXO system, an unspent transaction output system. This is very different to Ethereum because Ethereum does it account-based. So let me give you an example. In Bitcoin, if I send you a Bitcoin, then it's not that your account balance gets updated with one Bitcoin. The system in the background stores this one Bitcoin as an unspent output. So you haven't used this one Bitcoin that came in. And you can compare it if I give you a dollar note. Let's say you don't have a balance that updates and now you own $1, but you just have this note, and then I give you $10 and then I give you $100. It's not necessarily necessary that you know that you now own $111. I mean, even though it's great to know that. But it is important that you're able to spend those. So you make those unspent outputs, the dollars that you got, and you can use them. And Bitcoin works very similar. So whenever you transfer Bitcoins to someone or you receive Bitcoins, it's not that your account balance gets updated. It's actually that just these unspent outputs, UTXOs, they get stored and you can use them again later. Ethereum is very different because Ethereum needs to update the state of the actual account balances every single time. Very different system. And this is very important also to understand, because if you compare this, it's now very relevant to see how you can actually go forward and how you can actually use those. Because what happens with those UTXOs, with those unspent outputs, is that you can now go and sign the new transaction with an existing unspent output, making it spent. And this is key. Now, you can even split those unspent outputs. So you can make one Bitcoin unspent output into two, in two halves. Now, this is not possible with a dollar bill. You can't just cut it, and now you have two $0.5 bills. This doesn't work. You would need change. Maybe a bit of a side question. How do wallets then show your balance? Well, it's very simple. It just tracks all your private keys and checks what are the unspent outputs out there that are associated with your private key. And then it just adds them together and it gives you a total balance. Even though in the network itself, this does not really exist. It's purely unspent outputs. These unspent outputs get stored. But if you think about it, the blockchain in Bitcoin is nothing else than its entire history of these unspent outputs. It's an update history, a transaction history, from to how much, and that's nothing else than what these unspent outputs actually do. The entire history in Bitcoin at the moment, beginning in 2019, is around 200 gigabytes, so that's the entire history, and it keeps growing. Aside of that, there is a storage of these unspent outputs, and at the moment we have around 50 million of these unspent outputs, and the total size of those is 3 gigabyte. I will link up the resources for this below, but here's the interesting question. Do you actually need the entire history? Do you actually need the blockchain in order to have a couple of things? Namely, to have that no one can create coins out of thin air. This is very important. That the person who actually receives coins is the person who can actually send those. And that a person cannot double spend their coins. And that is very important to ask, because if those three things fall together, so that you can create coins, that the person receiving coins is not the person who could send them, and that you could double spend, then the entire system falls apart. So do we actually need the entire history? Now, the reason we keep the UTXO set is because it's very easy for nodes then to verify is a transaction valid or not. It does not really necessarily need the entire history. The entire history is great, but it causes some challenges. And the challenges are very, very straightforward, and we actually have known about those for quite some time. The very first one is privacy. Because we know the entire history, well, it's very easy to back calculate, and that's why we call most cryptocurrencies pseudo-anonymous and not fully anonymous. This causes another problem, that's fungibility. If one coin becomes tainted, then it's worth less than another coin. It's a concept that I discuss extensively in my book, Cryptocurrencies Explained Simply. And the last thing is size. Storing the entire blockchain is huge. It doesn't, in most smartphones, you can't store 200 gigabytes, and the transactions and all the sending and receiving of data is quite difficult. Now, if you only would have to do 2 or 3% of that, that would be fantastic for scalability, for accessibility, for inclusiveness. And you will see that this would actually be possible to drop the entire history. Now, it's not going to stay at only 2%. It will go up a bit because of something called range proofs, but we're going to be discussing this and how this actually works. And so understanding what we need. So we need to be able to prove that someone is actually sending the coins that this person owns. This person is not creating coins, and this person doesn't do double spend. If we could remove the history, we would get a lot of benefits. And different coins, different systems approach these problems, try to solve these problems. But what's very interesting, in August 2016, there was this new protocol that came around, and it's called Mimblewimble. And it was actually a very mysterious way how Mimblewimble basically got into this world. It's very similar to how Bitcoin got into this world in a mysterious way. In this case, there was this anonymous user called Tom Elvis Jedusor. And this is just a story out of the Harry Potter series. It's the French translation for Voldemort. It's Voldemort, and it's actually the actual name of him. And he dropped this paper into a Bitcoin developer IRC channel. Initially, everyone was kind of hesitant. It was like, not sure if we should touch this. But then Andrew Pelstra, a Bitcoin core developer, and who also works for Blockstream, grabbed it, looked at it, and he really liked the approach. He rewrote a couple of things, like polished it up, and then he reposted that in October 2016. Gave some couple of talks, and from there, this protocol called Mimblewimble kind of caught on. And Mimblewimble is this spell in the Harry Potter of being a tongue twister, leaving victims speechless. It is very important, though, looking into all this, before we go into the math, how this works, to kind of keep one thing in mind. Similar like in Bitcoin, nothing new got invented through Mimblewimble. All the building blocks, Coincoin, confidential transactions, and so on, all things we're going to be discussing, they have been described before, for example, by Gregory Maxwell. It's just that they got put together in new ways, and the math is very elegant and very clean. And even though we're not going into the math too deeply here, we're going to do this in a separate episode in Crash Course Cryptography. It is important to mention that just how Satoshi didn't reinvent all these concepts, they were already there. It's just sometimes about putting them together in a new way. And this is very important. Initially, and this is also, I think, relevant to mention, people hoped they could upgrade Bitcoin with Mimblewimble, adding all these privacy features. But because of the lack of a scripting language in Mimblewimble, a scripting language that Bitcoin has for logic, for example, for atomic swaps and Lightning, it's missing in Mimblewimble. So if there would be somehow a connection, it would have to go through a sidechain. But there's all kind of stuff that, well, people are working on. Mimblewimble, it's important to understand, is a protocol. So it's basically a concept laid out in mathematics. The implementation is done through projects, through companies. And in this case, it's actually done through two that we're going to be discussing also at the end. One is an actual company called Beam, and the other one is the earlier version, Grin, which is the community project that started right afterwards at the end of 2016. And we're going to look at those, and we're going to compare the two and kind of ask ourselves, how is this implementation actually working? But before we do this, let's go and talk about Mimblewimble Eli 5. So explain it like I'm 5. And I think this is important. I'll try to keep this simple. I will go into some things, and yeah, let's try to take it from there. If you want the detailed version, go to Crash Course Cryptography. I'll post the video there as well. Now remember, we need to have three things in order for the entire crypto system or for a cryptocurrency to work. I mean, obviously we have a lot of other things like censorship, persistence, decentralization, and so on, but we're really talking now about the cryptography of the economics of a coin. Now the key thing is no new coins can be created. I mean, that's a no-brainer. If someone can create new coins, well, the entire system is done, right? This doesn't work. Then obviously a new person I send coins to has to be the person who's gonna then control these coins again. Also very straightforward, otherwise it's useless, you never control the coins. And the other thing is, you're not allowed to do any double spend. Also quite straightforward. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Bitcoin does this because it's so transparent, people can track all these things. In Mimblewimble, the exact opposite happens. There are actually no public addresses. Also, you don't see transaction amounts. You don't see froms to tos. So what you're actually seeing is, you don't know who is sending how much to whom. But you are supposed to trust this system. And I think every time you hear this for the first time, you're like, what? How is this supposed to work? And to me, this is always the mind-blown moment, because the crazy thing is, it does. And it does work that even though you don't know who is sending how much to whom, and you can still trust the system, by using some very elegant maths and some very elegant crypto. And in general, it's three things. It's Coincoin, confidential transactions, and additionally, you don't necessarily need it from the crypto side, but most of the Mimblewimble implementations use it. It's something called Dandelion. So let's go through those three things in an easy term, and let's kind of work this out. Let's discuss the very first one, Coincoin. Coincoin is something that was actually introduced by Gregory Maxwell. It's something similar that's also being used in Schnorr signatures. Here you can see, I'll link it up below, well, actually the entire description of it. How this basically works is, instead of one transaction being created by a from, a to, and then the amount being signed by the sender's private key, and then you have this transaction ID goes into a block, and then the entire block gets mined. What happens is, you you multiply those transaction IDs on top of each other. So you sign the next transaction, the next transaction, the next transaction. So in a Mimblewimble block, it's not that all these hashes, all these transaction IDs get put under each other and then they form this new large block. It's one gets multiplied on top of the next one, the next one, the next one, the next one. And in cryptography, this works by not being possible to kind of going back, but you can prove that your transaction is included in the later hash, because otherwise it would have been statistically impossible or probabilistically impossible to get to the point where you're actually ending up on the cryptographic curve. And if this is completely confusing and you really want to understand this, go on my crash course Cryptography. I discuss these things in great detail and I really dig it down into the gnarly itsy bitsy parts. Here, just keep this as a general idea. Now, what this means is, what Coincoin allows is, it allows basically to mix transactions. And it completely makes it impossible for an outsider to see the details of an individual transaction because they all get added on top of each other. The second thing is, well, it's a complete improvement on size. You don't need to store everything. You kind of multiply them on top of each other and you only need one hash for the entire block. And this is a humongous advantage, especially size-wise. Now, I want to be clear that other cryptocurrencies, for example, Monero with their Beryllium proofs, for example, has been really doing some great work in improving the size of transactions. It is important to note that in many, many privacy coins, the size is a real hurdle for them to be implemented in scale and to really grow. And this is where, for example, Mimblewimble has an amazing extra step and is doing something very well. So this is Coincoin. Now let's discuss the second one, and that's confidential transactions. Confidential transactions is based on what's called Peterson commitments. And Peterson commitments mean that I could cryptographically cancel lefts and rights out if they go into zero. And this is a very actually simple term because what this allows me to do is I can show to an outsider that I didn't create any new coins without telling the person the actual amount. What is important is not so much how many coins I'm sending. It's important to me as a sender and the receiver. I mean, it's clear. But to an outside observer, this is not so relevant. What's more relevant for the outside observer is that I'm not creating any new coins. That's the key part. So the easiest thing to do this is for a mathematical equation, and this is done with Peterson commitments, to state you need to get to zero in a certain commitment. And you do this by saying the UTXO inputs, so that I am receiving or that I have unspent so far, minus the new UTXOs needs to be zero. Because that means if the originals and the new ones are equal, well, I couldn't have created or destroyed any coins. And this is the major key concept here. And this is very, very straightforward. Something that we're adding here is what's called a blinding factor. And we're adding this blinding factor in order to obscure the sender address, the amount, and the receiving address. And the reason we're doing this is because then for someone trying to send the coins with the new UTXO, this person needs to know his private key, but also the actual blinding factor that was used. Because only then it's possible to then send the new UTXO and actually unobscure the total amount. So to an outsider, you just use a large number, random number, and you multiply basically this into the amount. And what then happens is, for an outsider, it's impossible to know what the actual amounts are, what the actual addresses are. Only the participants involved can see this. And as you can imagine this, and there's Beam actually who wrote a blog post, it's not 100% accurate in my opinion. I will go into the actual cryptography in the crash course series, but just as a simplification here, imagine you have this calculation here, this equation, A times B equals 117. And then I ask you, what's A and what's B? And you might be saying, okay, Julian, but A and B equals 117, there could be an unlimited amount of possibilities. Actually, there's not. If you're looking for integers, so not floating point numbers, integers, there's only there's actually only one solution. There's actually two solutions, but let's just talk one solution, and that's 7 times 17. And the reason this works is because they're prime numbers. So there's no other way to get to 119 with two numbers. So in this case, it's very easy to kind of try this. I mean, it takes some time, but you can try this. If I use really, really large numbers, it's very difficult to understand the blinding factors. And so for me, it's important to say, hey, look, I know these numbers for the equations to work. And to an outsider, this is not really possible. Now, here's the trick though. There was a second solution, and for those of you that paid attention, you notice, it would be 1 times 117. And in the case of Peterson commitments, it's actually 0, but in this case, we're just using 1. And so I could use A equals 1, B equals 117, and I still get the same number. That's why we need something called range proofs. And these range proofs are super essential. They're super essential because what I could do otherwise is the following. Imagine this scenario. I have an old unspent output and it's 5. So I could spend 5 Bitcoins. or 5 Mimblewimble coins, right? Now imagine I create 2 new outputs. Remember, I can split outputs. And I create one that's 10, so someone receives 10 Bitcoins, and another one just receives -5. Now, because in Mimblewimble, you cannot see this to the outside. These outputs just have to fit together, and the old and the new has to cancel each other out. This works, because 5 equals 10 minus 5, which is also 5. But in this case, 10 new coins were created. So what you need to be able to do is you need to produce so-called range proofs that you are staying within a certain range of numbers. And this is very important, and these range proofs need to be stored. And this is also the reason why the blockchain, in this case Mimblewimble, is not the 2% that you would only need if you only stored the UTXOs, but it's a bit larger because you need to store the range proofs. And this is actually the major difference. In Mimblewimble, you can cancel the old outputs and you only need to store the actual state that happens right now of output. So you don't need to store the entire history. And this is a humongous advantage, because now it's not that the blockchain keeps growing, keeps growing, keeps growing. It actually fluctuates depending on the amount of outputs. Yeah, sometimes it might be a bit larger, sometimes it might be a bit smaller, but at the end it doesn't constantly grow. And still, if the math is correct and you trust the cryptography, you will obscure transactions. You don't know the from, you don't know the to, you don't know the amounts, but you can be sure that the person who actually received coins is the only one who can keep sending them because of the private key and the blinding factors. And because these equations need to cancel each other out, you can be sure that no one created these coins. The last thing, and this is one key point, is double spending though. Since no one can see this, how can one person make sure that even though there's no blockchain history, there's still no double spend possible? And this works because in theory, parties have to be online to use Mimblewimble and then track the UTXOs. Now, in Mimblewimble implementations, this is done through the wallets that kind of manage all this and do this. And then this way, suddenly the UTXO is spent, and if you wait just a little bit, you have what's called a transaction that is then just not valid, because suddenly this UTXO is not there anymore. The UTXO can only be used just once because it can only be referenced once. So this is very important here. So you kind of make sure all these points are there. Now here, extra credit, and this is just going a little bit into detail. Understanding maybe a bit more of the math, just imagine this way. You have this little formula here, and this is not the actual Mimblewimble formula. This is way more complex, but just give as an example. Imagine A plus the old UTXO plus the new UTXO times B needs to equal 119. Now we know, oh sorry, 117, so that's wrong here, equals 117. Now we have done this before. I'm not sure why it says 119 here everywhere, sorry. So we know from before that 7 times, oh no, this is correct, I'm sorry. Okay, now I got too excited. I thought I had a mistake here. So we know from before that 7 times 17 equals 119. So this means that this part here has to be 0. And that is how we can be sure in this formula that I need to know the blinding factors, in this case A and B, and I need to be sure that the old and the new UTXOs cancel each other out, so I haven't created any coins. And this is how the extra credit works. We'll go deeper into this kind of idea in cryptography though. So this is very important, and I hope this kind of makes sense to you. So we talked about Coincoin, we talked about confidential transactions. Let's briefly cover Dandelion. Dandelion is not necessarily a cryptographic concept, it's more of a network concept. Basically what you do is, instead of you sending out the transaction in Mimblewimble and then everyone sees where it arrives, and because of the delay you can know who it is, it works like a dandelion. So you blow and then it goes out. Some parts go quicker, some parts go slower, and that kind of obscures who is actually sending, who is receiving, kind of obscures all this. We're not going to go too much into Dandelion here. We're going to do a separate video on this because it's not so much of a cryptographic concept, and it's very easy and kind of vivid to understand. So we have all these exciting upsides, right? We have very small size, we have really great privacy, but then, so there must be downsides. And there are downsides. So if we look here at Mimblewimble downsides, well, it's very straightforward. We don't have a scripting language that Bitcoin does. We need this for logic. So we need to see how scriptless scripts would be working. It's important. The second thing is, we covered this, people should actually be online at the same time. Wallets kind of take care of this. We have these range proofs. They are extremely expensive to calculate, but they're not going to go away. Without these range proofs, the entire chain would fall apart, because if someone in the past didn't provide a proper range proof, this could mean this person generated 1 billion coins and no one would ever find out, right? Very important. Now, we do have this question always from a regulatory point of view. What are privacy coins used for? If you can't track them, you don't know who these people are. And I actually go extensively into this, more from a philosophical discussion almost, in my book, Cryptocurrencies Explained Simply. Here's the link if you want to have this. I'll put the link down below as well. And that brings me to the last 2 points. In Mimblewimble, you really have to trust the crypto because it's not auditable. Yes, you know the crypto works, but it's so counterintuitive for someone looking at it from the outside. And obviously, that's by design. And the last one is very straightforward. We always see this when things come around that are completely new, that are not used for exchanges, for wallets, and so on. The adoption always takes because the industry is not ready for these things yet. And if you're using a ledger, the ledger model, for example, I use, I've linked it down below, then this ledger model doesn't work with Mimblewimble. It takes time until this new technology comes up. And obviously, this is very different than, for example, integrating an ERC20 coin. I don't know, that is a very big standard. So I think that's very straightforward and quite relevant to kind of get and understand. So discussing how does this work, where's it coming from, there's 2 implementations at the moment, and they kind of started at different times, different philosophy, so this is always also interesting and relevant to understand. We have Grin and we have Beam. I linked up the websites, linked them up below. They started different times. Grin, as mentioned before, was started actually by the community, and again, it was started by an unknown person. He used the pseudonym Ignodos Peverell, and he's also from the Harry Potter story. He started this right after Andrew Poelstra came out, posted this white paper end of 2016, beginning of 2017, and it's a pure community project. You can compare it almost to how Linux kind of works, written in Rust. On the other side, we have Beam. Beam is a company from Israel. They paid themselves part of the mining rewards. This is very different to how the financing at Grin works, where it's really a community focus. They started around a year ago. Their entire code is in C++, way more common obviously than Rust, even though many people think that Rust would be a better choice. And you could compare them more to the Apple-Microsoft story in this case, more company focused. The launch, Beam was first, even though they started afterwards. They launched right a couple of weeks ago, beginning of 2019. Grin launched right afterwards, but second. They use a different mining algorithm. So Beam is on Equihash, Grin is on QQ-Cycle. Both of them are ASIC resistant. So if you're interested in mining, you need to use GPUs. Don't get tricked that you could mine on CPUs. Forget that. But they're ASIC resistant, so there's no application-specific hardware. And yeah, we're going to do a separate video if this is good or if this is bad, but this is very, very important. A big difference, obviously, aside of being community versus company, is the cap. Grin doesn't have a cap. It has an asymptotic approach to an amount, but it doesn't really have a cap. And this is relevant because in their opinion, they don't like a purely deflationary currency. Very interesting. Obviously, there's up and downsides to this, right? And Beam has a cap at 263 million coins. If you want to buy those coins, I linked up exchanges here, and I'll link them up below where you can buy them. And now, obviously, here is the relevant question. Should you be investing in those or not? As with any coin, you have to ask yourself 3 questions, and that's always important. Is a clear use case solving a real-world problem? Very key. My personal opinion is, yes, it does. It's relevant to have privacy, and it's relevant to have some kind of, I don't know, insurance policy against what happens if Bitcoin doesn't work out from a regulatory perspective, because it's too transparent. The second thing is the UX, the user experience. How are the wallets? How is all this working? And this is a major question, right? And a major question always between a community project and a company. Company can be very money-driven versus community can be very community-driven. And the last thing is always the size of the network. How many users are there? How many actual use cases are there? What are the exchanges? And this is very, very important. At the moment, Beam is slightly ahead, as it seems, in form of hashing power and users. But this doesn't mean it stays this way, and this is very important. So this is kind of the summary here, but I cannot take the decision for you if you should be investing or not. I personally have decided to put a little bit of money in this because I think it is very interesting, and I put them into both coins. just because, and that's important, I cannot make up my mind right now which one is going to be better and which one is going to have a brighter future. Hopefully maybe both of them, right? And there would be space for both of them. I think this is also a bit ridiculous to always fight each other just because there's 2 coins around. And also, there is a space for 3, 4 coins, and there are great other technologies. I do have money in Monero because I think it's also great technology and it's a great team. But this is always very important to understand. And for you, obviously, the question is, should you or should you not? Remember, don't put in too much money. Always put in less than you can afford to lose, right? This is always the best. And the other thing is, be careful right now, since the mining rewards are quite high in relation to how many coins are out there, because it's an exponential decreasing mining reward. So right now there's a lot of mining rewards. There is a lot of selling pressure right now. So just keep this in mind, because I think it will take a little bit of time until the price kind of stabilizes. But I think that's very important, and it is a very exciting project, very kind of new tech, very new math, very new approaches. And I hope this kind of makes sense to you, and I hope it's been quite clear. If you have any questions, if you like this stuff, if you want to give me a thumbs up, please do so. Let me know in the comments below what you think about this. Let me know what you like. And yeah, if anything is there, or if you just want to say a thank you, very much looking forward to that whenever I do these videos. Anyways, I do these videos mainly not so much for everyone else. I do them so that I have a very clear overview and I make a very good investment decision for myself, and then I kind of present this. This is just maybe the icing on the cake for me, right? If you want to understand something very clear, explain it to someone else. So, hope you like it. Do me a favor, click the like button, share this if you feel this is worth sharing, and I hope it is. And if you're not connected with me on social media, all the links are down below. I've put all the links there anyways. And yeah, subscribe to the channel if you want to stay updated on blockchain, crypto, entrepreneurship, mindset, and so on. I'll see you at the next video. Yours truly, Julian.